so powerful that they seem impossible to forget. Egypt, with its towering pyramids rising from the desert, Greece, with its philosophy that reshaped Western thought, and Rome, with its mighty empire stretching across Europe. Yet before these civilizations shone brightly, there was another people, a small community in the harsh land of Mesopotamia, who laid down the very first foundations of human history. They were the Sumerians. And strangely enough, although they created the earliest writing, city-states, laws, astronomy, and epic poetry, the name Sumer nearly vanished for millennia, lingering only as a faint whisper from the distant past. In tonight's episode of Bedtime History, we will journey back to reconstruct the story of Sumer from its very beginnings, from the small riverside villages to the rise of city-states and the first states, from the invention of writing to the epic of Gilgamesh, from the towering ziggurat temples to the role of women, art, and music, from internal conflicts to their eventual rise and downfall before the empires that followed. This will not only be a rediscovery of a lost civilization, but also a way to understand ourselves more deeply, why human beings learn to organize, to remember, and to tell the story of history. And to begin, let us return to the southern land that today we call Iraq, a flat expanse stretching all the way to the horizon, where harsh winds and relentless sun burn the earth into a dry, brown plain. Here, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers wind like two green ribbons across the desert, carrying fertile silt that enriches vast fields. It was on this seemingly unforgiving land more than 5,000 years ago that human beings discovered how to transform it into the cradle of the very first civilization. The ancient Greeks called this place Mesopotamia, meaning between two rivers. And indeed, few regions in the ancient world offered such perfect conditions to spark a great turning point in human history. When the first communities settled along the riverbanks, they quickly realized that nature was both a giver of life and a constant threat. The annual floods of the Tigris and Euphrates delivered rich layers of silt that turned barren soil into farmland, yet these same floods could swallow entire villages if left unchecked. This unpredictability forced people to cooperate, to learn how to build dikes, dig canals, and channel water, creating one of the most sophisticated irrigation systems of the ancient world. The challenge of water and land, impossible for a single family to solve, pushed communities to move beyond the boundaries of their small villages. From this necessity, the outlines of the earliest city-states began to emerge. At first, the inhabitants here were only small groups of farmers who cultivated barley fields, raised sheep, goats, and pigs, and built modest huts of reeds and mud bricks. But to resist the floods, they needed long dikes that no single household could construct. To bring water to their fields, they required canals stretching for kilometers, demanding the coordinated labor of hundreds of people. And when it came time to divide the water, someone had to decide how much each plot would receive, to settle disputes when a canal was blocked, or when drought cracked the entire plain. Out of these challenges, the need for organization, leadership, and laws gradually took shape. Figures of authority, often war leaders or priests, began to assume central roles, gathering the community and directing labor. Over time, the villages grew, connected, and transformed into larger centers of population. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence at Uruk, considered the first true city in human history, that its population may have reached tens of thousands by the 4th millennium before Christ. This number far exceeded that of any village at the time, turning Uruk into something entirely new, a city-state where inhabitants lived not only as kin, but as citizens of a wider community with political organization, laws, and a complex economic system. Mesopotamia was not only farmland, it was also a natural crossroads of cultures and resources. To the north lay the Anatolian highlands, rich in metal ores. To the east, the Zagros Mountains with their pastoral and hunting tribes. To the south, the Persian Gulf opening to the trade routes of the Indian Ocean. This strategic position made the land a hub of commerce, where goods, techniques, and ideas were exchanged. The Sumerians, the first people to build cities in southern Mesopotamia, relied not only on agriculture, but quickly became skillful merchants, using their location to accumulate power. What made this transformation extraordinary was the leap from simple subsistence farming to a diverse economy. In small villages, everyone had to do everything: grow crops, weave cloth, make tools. But with the birth of cities came specialization. Some became full-time potters, others wove textiles. Some forged bronze, others traded, while still others did not engage in direct production at all, but served as managers, priests, or administrators. This division of labor allowed society to grow at an unprecedented pace, as each individual could devote their full energy to one field, improving skills and efficiency. Yet alongside this population and economic boom came new tensions. Land ownership, access to irrigation, and the distribution of grain created gaps between wealthy families and the poor. Local elites, often descended from chiefs or priests, accumulated power, while most farmers and artisans became dependent. Here lay the seeds of social inequality, but also the foundation for more sophisticated political institutions. A Sumerian city-state was not simply a large community. It was a complete social organism, walled fortifications to protect against enemies, massive temples at its center to symbolize connection with the gods, centralized grain storage facilities for reserves and distribution, and a class of officials to collect taxes, record transactions, and oversee production. In fact, clay seals found in Uruk and Lagash reveal that administrative offices already existed, where officials used seal impressions to control the flow of goods. The rise of the city-state was a true historical turning point. From small villages, people had created complex social machines where power, religion, economy, and culture were tightly interwoven. No longer bound by kinship alone, the city-state became an independent political entity with borders, government, armies, and above all, ambition to expand. But managing such a dense and complicated community could not rely solely on speech or memory. People needed a new tool to record laws, to track grain stores, and to preserve their collective memory. And it was from this need that one of humanity's most important inventions was born: writing. At the beginning, writing was nothing more than simple drawings that imitated objects: a cow represented by the outline of a cow's head, a jar of wine shown as a circle with a line across it. These signs were pressed onto small clay tokens, which were then sealed inside hollow clay envelopes called bulli to record transactions. Every time a farmer brought goods to the city-state storehouse, he would present one of these bullae as proof of how many animals or sacks of grain he had delivered. This was the earliest form of accounting, a seemingly ordinary necessity, yet one that opened the path to the birth of writing. Over time, the symbols multiplied and grew more complex. It was no longer enough to mark physical objects. Abstract ideas also needed to be recorded: numbers, dates, the names of people, and even the names of the gods. Drawing each sign by hand became clumsy and labor-intensive, which forced the Sumerians to develop a more efficient method. They began using a small reed stylus cut to a triangular tip to press into soft clay tablets and create wedge-shaped marks. From this innovation, the cuneiform script was born. At first, writing served only the needs of officials and priests. They used it to record the amount of barley in the granaries, the livestock belonging to temples, debts owed, or the number of craftsmen working for the city-state. But once the power of writing became undeniable, its use spread beyond accounting. Kings wanted their victories carved into memory, leaving messages for generations to come. Priests wished to preserve myths, rituals, and hymns. Merchants needed contracts for trade and ways to send messages to distant lands. Thus, writing was no longer just a tool of management, it became the medium of memory, culture, and authority. The wonder of it all is how, within just a few centuries, writing transformed how human beings thought about time and existence. Before, all memory depended on the spoken word, passed from one voice to another, vulnerable to distortion or loss. But with cuneiform tablets, words became fixed in clay, enduring across generations. Tablets recording grain deliveries, inscriptions describing battles, myths etched into stone. All of these became a doorway into the past, allowing us even today to hear the voices of the Sumerians from 5,000 years ago. Even more, writing carried an invisible power. It reinforced authority. Only a select few, those trained to read and write, could control information. The class of scribes became the backbone of Sumerian society. Trained from childhood, they spent each day carving hundreds of wedge-shaped signs onto clay. Their task was not just to write, but to ensure the very functioning of the city-state. Without them, grain could not be managed, taxes could not be collected, laws could not be proclaimed, and rituals could not be performed correctly. Writing allowed the Sumerians not only to build city-states, but also to construct a shared memory, creating history in the truest sense. From the moment those first wedge marks were pressed into clay, humanity entered a completely new chapter, the chapter of civilization. Yet a city could not survive on writing alone. It also needed a beating heart, a spiritual and political center to bind its people together. That heart was the city itself, those urban centers of politics, economy, and religion. In Sumer, for the very first time in history, human beings created true cities, not merely villages that had grown larger, but centers where tens of thousands of people lived together, bound by systems of law, networks of trade, and shared beliefs. Names such as Uruk, Ur, and Lagash became the pivots of civilization, each city carrying its own story, reflecting the ambitions, the power, and the tragedies of the Sumerians. Uruk, the city of the legendary Gilgamesh, was perhaps the first place in human history where the idea of a complete city took form. Its massive defensive walls, stretching for many miles, stood as a declaration that this was no longer a fragile village at the mercy of floods or invaders, but a proud political entity, prepared to face foreign threats. Within those walls, markets thrived. Earthen streets led to the busy river docks where traders arrived with goods from afar and departed with cargo destined for the wider region. Uruk embodied the very concept of a full city, at once a spiritual center, a hub of commerce, and a gathering place for a vast urban population. Not far from Uruk, the city of Ur rose with a different kind of splendor. If Uruk was the pioneer, Ur represented the height of order and prosperity. Ur was the capital of one of the most powerful Sumerian dynasties, the Ur III period, when it became the political heart of southern Mesopotamia. The ruins that survive, especially the great ziggurat of Ur, still astonish with their scale and endurance. Ur's wealth came not only from agriculture and irrigation, but also from its role as a commercial crossroads linking the Persian Gulf to the inland world. From Ur, fleets of ships sailed to Dilmun, modern Bahrain, Oman, and even the Indus Valley, bringing back precious stones, timber, and rare metals, the very resources absent from the fertile plains. This wealth transformed Ur into a dazzling city where royalty lived in grand palaces, nobles in luxurious villas, and skilled artisans produced exquisite works of art, such as the famed Standard of Ur, which captured both daily life and sacred ritual in a single vivid panel. Lagash, though less celebrated than Uruk or Ur in popular stories, stands as a remarkable example of the competitiveness and diversity of Sumerian city-states. Lagash flourished as a powerful center for centuries, leaving behind some of the clearest evidence of legal and administrative development. Inscriptions found there, particularly the prayer statue of King Gudea, reveal a different vision of kingship, where the ruler was not only a warrior or governor, but also a temple builder, a guardian of religion, and a bringer of justice. Lagash was also notorious for its recurring conflicts with the neighboring city-state of Umma over farmland and water rights. These disputes were not merely economic. They stand as some of the earliest recorded struggles over a timeless issue: how to divide limited resources fairly in an increasingly crowded world. The unifying feature of all Sumerian cities was the fusion of political, religious, and economic power. At the heart of every city stood a monumental temple, not only the dwelling place of the gods, but also the storehouse of grain, the seat of administration, and the treasury. Civic authority was almost inseparable from the priesthood, since the gods were considered the true owners of the land, while kings and officials merely acted as their stewards. This structure of power was both complex and enduring, binding the fate of every inhabitant to both the divine and the civic order. And from this tightly woven system, a new question arose: how could such a growing, intricate community be governed and kept in order? In any crowded society, when tens of thousands of people live together in a confined space, the greatest question is always the same: how can order be maintained? In small villages, disputes could be settled by the authority of the village elder, but in Uruk, Ur, or Lagash, where populations had grown into the tens of thousands, where fields stretched for dozens of miles, and where irrigation canals and dikes required the coordinated labors of hundreds, words alone were no longer enough. It was in this environment that the first steps of the state and law emerged, opening a new political order for all of Mesopotamia. At the beginning, power often rested in the hands of priests, the representatives of the gods. Temples became the economic centers, places where grain was collected, wealth stored, and seed, tools, and food distributed to farmers. Yet, as the city-states expanded, governance could no longer depend solely on ritual authority. A new class of military leaders, and later the Lugal, meaning the great man, rose to organize labor, defend the city, and resolve conflicts. Over time, the office of the Lugal evolved into the foundation of kingship itself. Political authority, however, never stood apart on its own. It was interwoven with religion and economics, forming a system that can best be described as a proto-state. Kings ruled in the name of the gods, temples functioned both as houses of worship and as centers of administration. Scribes, armed with clay tablets and reed styluses, became indispensable instruments of power, recording every transaction, decree, and inventory. Here, writing, the great invention, was put to use as the very tool that shaped and preserved social order. The early Sumerian state, therefore, did not resemble the modern nation-state. It was more like an extension of the family and community, but structured with laws and binding authority. The king was not only the commander of armies, but also the father of the people, the representative before the gods. Every decree, every construction, every war was understood as carrying out divine will. This fusion gave authority a legitimacy that was difficult to question, while also maintaining the cohesion of the community. Yet the birth of the state and the law also brought complex consequences. It reinforced social hierarchies. Kings, nobles, priests, and scribes stood above, farmers and artisans below, and slaves at the bottom of society. Power became a tool through which a small elite controlled the wealth and labor of the many. At the same time, it created opportunities for long-term growth. Law allowed trade to function securely. Government ensured that massive irrigation projects were maintained. Scribes preserved collective memory across generations. Still, a society cannot endure solely on military strength and dry codes of law. It requires a worldview, a metaphysical belief, to explain why people must obey, why the harsh trials of nature occur, and why everything exists. For the Sumerians, the answer always lay with the gods, the divine powers who governed every wind, every river, every field, and the destiny of every human life. From this faith, a cosmic order was formed, binding human existence tightly to the sacred structure of the universe. In the Sumerian mind, the universe was layered, woven between gods and humans, between life and death, between order and chaos. Above all was An, the lofty sky, ruled by Anu, the god of the heavens and ultimate authority. Beneath lay Ki, the vast earth, the realm of the goddess Ninhursag, also called Kai, mother of all living things and source of fertility. Between these two realms stretched the space of human life, governed by Enlil, the god of wind and air, one of the most powerful figures in Sumerian mythology. Below them all was Ker, the dark underworld, where the souls of the dead dwelled. It was not a paradise of joy, but a somber shadow where every spirit, rich or poor, was destined to go. The Sumerian cosmos was a divine cosmos. Every natural event was explained through the will of the gods. When the rivers rose in flood, it was the anger of Enki, the god of water and wisdom. When drought scorched the land, it was punishment from the agricultural deities. When war broke out, it was believed to be the will of Inanna, the goddess of love and war, embodiment of both creation and destruction. Thus, human life could never be separated from the divine. Each harvest, each birth, each battle was framed as part of the gods' designs. What made the Sumerian mythology remarkable was its complexity and its deeply human quality. The gods were not omnipotent or flawless beings. They quarreled, grew jealous, fell in love, and raged in anger. They could aid humanity, but just as easily destroy it in a fit of wrath. On clay tablets we find myths that are at once majestic and intimate, Enki tricking others to bring water to mankind, Inanna descending into the underworld only to be trapped there, Gilgamesh searching for immortality and returning empty-handed. These stories did more than explain natural events. They mirrored human psychology, fear, and longing at the dawn of civilization. The Sumerian worldview rested on a strange duality, both fear and gratitude. They feared because they knew their smallness before the overwhelming power of nature and the gods. Yet they were grateful, for under divine protection, humanity could survive in such a harsh land. Out of this balance arose a vibrant religion with festivals to honor the gods and sacred rituals such as the annual sacred marriage between the king and the goddess Inanna, symbolizing the fertility of the fields and prosperity of the nation. This worldview did more than explain existence. It shaped the very way the Sumerians lived, worked, and built their communities. To serve the gods and to demonstrate reverence, they raised monumental structures of mud brick, stair-stepped towers stretching toward the heavens, the ziggurats, eternal symbols of their faith. A ziggurat was not like the Egyptian pyramid, the eternal resting place of the pharaohs. It was a living monument, used every day as a place of ritual, a storehouse of wealth, and a keeper of collective memory. Its structure was built of massive mud brick blocks stacked into multiple tiers, each level smaller than the one below it, rising upward toward the sky. At the top stood a small shrine, believed to be the dwelling place of the city's patron deity. From afar, A ziggurat looked like a mountain rising from the flat plain, a powerful image, for to the Sumerians, mountains were the abodes of the gods. In their featureless landscape, where no real mountains rose, they built their own sacred mountains with their hands. Every major city-state had its central ziggurat dedicated to its supreme deity. In the great ziggurat honored Nanna, the moon god. In Uruk, the Eanna temple complex was devoted to the goddess Inanna. In Eridu, the temple was consecrated to Enki. People believed that on these very steps the gods could descend from heaven, bringing blessings for the harvest and protection for the community. Thus, the building and maintenance of ziggurats became sacred duties, closely tied to the prestige of the king and the prosperity of the city-state itself. Yet a ziggurat could not fulfill its role without those who managed and served it, the priests. They were not merely intermediaries between humans and the divine, they formed a powerful class in their own right. Priests were skilled in astronomy, observing the sky to predict floods and planting seasons. They were mathematicians and surveyors, calculating and dividing land. They were the authors and guardians of myths, hymns, and rituals. In the scribal schools known as Eduba, young boys learning cuneiform did more than record inventories. They studied literature and laws handed down by the priesthood. Knowledge, economy, and religion intertwined in the hands of this class, making them an irreplaceable pillar of Sumerian society. The power of the priests was further reinforced through solemn rituals. Each year, during the New Year festival, the king was required to perform the sacred marriage with the goddess Inanna, represented by a high priestess. This ritual was not only religious, ensuring fertility and abundant harvests, but also political, affirming the union between royal authority and divine will. The ziggurat thus became the stage for ceremonies that were both sacred and symbolic, where the community felt the presence of the gods and the legitimacy of their king. And yet, behind the grandeur of the ziggurat, daily life in Sumer unfolded with ordinary concerns: ploughing fields, tending herds, trading in the markets, building homes, raising children. If the ziggurat and the priesthood embodied the metaphysical and the powerful, the daily routines of ordinary men and women revealed the practical foundation that sustained the entire civilization. It was in these simple, everyday activities that we glimpsed the living portrait of the world's first society, where spiritual values always sprang from the soil of daily human needs. The Sumerians were, above all, farmers. Agriculture was the foundation that sustained the city-state and the reason people gathered into large communities in the first place. Across the wide plains they cultivated barley, a grain better suited than wheat to the salty soils of Mesopotamia. Alongside it grew onions, garlic, beans, and dates, all staples of the daily diet. Their fields were complemented by herds of livestock, oxen to pull ploughs, sheep and goats for milk, wool, and meat. A Sumerian farmer rose before sunrise, guiding his oxen and wooden plough tipped with bronze, while irrigation canals carried water from the rivers into his fields. Farming here could never be separated from irrigation. A sudden flood or a long drought could ruin an entire harvest, so the control and distribution of water was a constant preoccupation of the whole community. Yet the city-state was far more than its fields. The division of labor allowed many to leave farming behind and devote themselves to crafts. Pottery kilns glowed day and night, producing jars, jugs, and storage vessels for grain and wine. Weavers turned sheep's wool into textiles, one of Sumer's most valuable exports. Metal workers smelted copper and later bronze, forging weapons and tools. Stone carvers and jewelers worked gold, silver, and imported gemstones into ornaments. These crafts did more than beautify life. They stood as markers of sophistication and prosperity. Trade, in turn, became the bridge between Sumer and the wider world. The alluvial plain was fertile but poor in many resources. Wood, stone, and precious metals were scarce. The Sumerians reached outward to Anatolia for copper and tin, to Persia for gemstones, and as far as the Indus Valley for turquoise and carnelian. In exchange, they carried textiles, oils, and grain. On reed boats and wooden ships, they sailed down rivers and across seas, weaving vast networks of commerce. Sumer was never a closed world, but one constantly open to exchange and influence. Within the city walls, markets formed the heartbeat of daily life. Sellers called out their wares, buyers bargained, and small clay tablets recorded transactions, sealed with intricately carved cylinder seals. The market was more than a place of trade. It was a place of gathering, of news, of chatter and storytelling. In these busy streets we see the living image of a society far removed from nomadic tribes, a society with surplus goods, economic exchange, and the earliest outlines of a market economy. But ordinary life was not without hardship. Taxes weighed heavily, often paid in kind with grain, livestock, or labor. Citizens were conscripted to dig canals, raise dikes, and build city walls. In years of poor harvests, families borrowed grain from temples or nobles, and if they could not repay, they risked losing their land or even falling into slavery. Inequality permeated society. At the top stood kings and priests, in the middle merchants and artisans, and at the bottom farmers and slaves. Even so, within this harshness, the life of the Sumerians carried its own simple joys. Meals centered on barley bread, porridge and beer, the staple drink brewed from grain, both nourishing and safer than the polluted river water. Festivals filled the air with music from harps, flutes, and drums. People told stories of gods and heroes, tales that would one day grow into myths and epics. Though burdened by toil, the ordinary people of Sumer lived with the small pleasures of community and tradition. It was their hands, the farmer guiding the plough, the weaver at the loom, the merchant rowing his boat, that gave Sumer its true vitality. Without them, there would have been no towering ziggurats, no carved monuments of kings. In the echoes of their daily lives, we find the real heartbeat of the world's first civilization, not only built upon myth and power, but upon the sweat and breath of ordinary men and women. And from this rhythm of daily life, another pillar of society took shape, the family. In the grand picture of Sumer, where city-states rose across the Mesopotamian plains, we are often captivated by towering monuments or trade routes stretching as far as the Indus Valley. Yet behind this splendor, it was family life, with its bonds of love, marriage, children, and the roles of women that truly formed the foundation on which Sumerian society endured. Here, some of humanity's most essential values, as well as its deepest inequalities, came into view. Women in Sumer held a role that was both complex and vital. They were not entirely hidden or confined, as in many later civilizations. Ancient texts reveal that women could own property, take part in trade, and that some served as priestesses with significant authority in religion. In Uruk, the goddess Inanna, the embodiment of love, war, and fertility, was the city's patron deity, and the sacred marriage ritual between the king and Inanna's high priestess was considered essential for prosperity. This reflected a profound acknowledgement. Women, tied to fertility and nurturing, were sacred in the eyes of the Sumerians. Still, within family life, women stood in a subordinate position to men. Marriage was not simply the union of two individuals, but above all, an arrangement between families. Clay tablets recording marriage contracts show that unions were often arranged, with dowries provided by the bride's family and bride gifts offered by the groom. Once married, a woman joined her husband's household with responsibilities to bear children, manage the home, and labor alongside the family. In an agricultural society, This meant heavy burdens, but also a hidden influence: women, safeguarded lineage, property, and the continuity of production. The earliest laws reveal this complexity. The Code of Urukagina, followed later by the laws of Lipit Ishtar and Hammurabi, all reference women's rights and duties. In certain circumstances, women could initiate divorce if a husband abandoned or failed to support them. They could also inherit property if no brothers were present. Yet inequality was clear. A wife's adultery was punished severely, while husbands could take concubines or slaves without violating the law. Children were regarded as the greatest treasure of a household. Having many children ensured the continuation of family lines and provided more hands for the fields. From an early age, children were guided into family trades. Sons followed their fathers into the fields or workshops. Daughters learned weaving, pottery, and household tasks from their mothers. Some children, however, were sent to the Aduba schools to learn writing with the hope of becoming scribes, a prestigious profession that could elevate the entire family's status. Education thus carried the potential for social mobility, though only a few could access it. Marriage also carried deep religious meaning. The sacred marriage ritual was not only symbolic for royalty, but also expressed the belief that the union of male and female mirrored the cosmic order. During spring festivals, music, beer, and love were woven into communal celebrations, reflecting harmony between humans, gods, and nature. In this sense, love and sexuality were not treated as taboos but as sacred forces when placed within the framework of religion and society. Yet family life in Sumer was full of contradictions. Women bore the immense burdens of childbirth, child-rearing, and agricultural labor, facing high risks of illness and death. Ancient medical texts record prayers to goddesses of childbirth, asking for protection in labor, a testament to the fragility of women's lives. Social class also shaped family experience. Noble women might live in large homes overseeing servants and slaves, while peasant women worked the fields, ground grain, wove cloth, and carried water alongside their husbands. Viewed broadly, the Sumerian family was a microcosm of society itself, ordered, divided, unequal, yet bound together. It was the cell that sustained the whole structure and reflected its deepest values, from reverence for the gods and faith in fertility to the desire to preserve lineage. And like every society, family life was woven into culture and art. The Sumerians poured their joys and sorrows of love, marriage, and family into music, poetry, and carved images. Through this, art did not only serve the gods and kings, but also echoed the everyday lives of ordinary people. In these songs, instruments, and designs, we find another vital piece of Sumer's soul, at once intimate and transcendent, both everyday and sacred. Sumerian art, above all, was inseparably bound to religion. Inside temples, stone and baked clay statues were erected to embody humans in the presence of the gods. One of the most striking examples is the group of votive statues discovered at Tel Asmar, figures with wide, round eyes and hands clasped before their chests in prayer. Those eyes, seemingly gazing through time itself, reflected awareness and unwavering faith in the constant presence of the divine within the Sumerian mind. These statues were not created for display, but to stand eternally in the temple, praying on behalf of the people, ensuring that the community's petitions to the gods would never cease. Beyond statues, decorative art also mirrored worldview and society. Cylinder seals, small, finely carved stone rollers used to stamp clay, were among Sumer's most distinctive creations. On them we see images of gods enthroned, processions of offerings, scenes of battle, or banquets. These seals were practical administrative tools securing documents and goods, yet they were also miniature works of art compressing the entire Sumerian cosmos into the palm of one's hand. In this way, art became a symbolic language, telling stories that writing itself had not yet fully captured. Music, too, held an indispensable place. In festivals, processions, and sacred rituals, music served as a bridge between humans and the gods. The Sumerians played harps, lyres, flutes, drums, and cymbals. At Ur, archaeologists uncovered the golden lyre, a more than 4,000-year-old instrument adorned with a golden bull's head, with eyes and beard inlaid with shell and lapis lazuli. The carved panels on the lyre depict mythological scenes where animals take on human roles, dancing, drinking, feasting, showing that music was not mere entertainment but a reenactment of cosmic order. The harp's melodies, the thunder of drums, and the lilting flutes turned every festival into a sacred moment where gods and humans met. If art and music were tangible expressions, symbols were the threads that wove through Sumerian thought. In their symbolism, the moon was linked to Nana, the sun to Utu, the god of justice, and the planet Venus to Inanna. The stars were not just lights in the sky, but divine signs, a heavenly script. The double-headed eagle, the winged lion, and the sacred bull reflected the fusion of natural strength and divine authority. These symbols were engraved onto seals, crafted into jewelry, and even set into royal crowns, constant reminders that earthly power drew its source from the supernatural cosmos. Art and symbolism also carried a political weight. One of the most famous works, the Standard of Ur, tells two stories on opposite sides, one of war and one of peace. On the war side, Sumerian soldiers march into battle, capture prisoners, and present spoils. On the peace side, the king feasts, surrounded by musicians and subjects offering tribute. This was more than illustration, it was a declaration. The king was both warrior and protector, but also the center of celebration and prosperity, the embodiment of social order. In this way, art became a servant of power, transforming royal image into an eternal symbol. In daily life, art appeared in simpler forms: pottery with engraved patterns, finely worked jewelry, bricks stamped with decorative molds. Sumerian women wore golden bracelets and earrings. Merchants carried staffs inlaid with gems. Every object was more than utility. It was a sign of status, of social bonds, and of faith in divine protection. Thus, art, music, and symbols did not merely reflect a creative society, but revealed a civilization deeply aware of the relationship between human beings, the gods, and the cosmos. We may have lost the melodies they once sang, but the instruments that remain, the statues and the seals, still whisper to us of an ancient spirit, fragile yet powerful. And as we step away from these sounds and images, the Sumerian story draws us back to their most legendary figure, Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, who crossed the boundary between history and myth to become an eternal symbol of humanity's search for meaning and immortality. Gilgamesh was at once a king, a hero, and a legendary figure. In Uruk, the city often regarded as the cradle of urban civilization, his name lives not only on fragmented clay tablets, but also in the imagination of humanity across millennia. The blend of history and myth surrounding Gilgamesh is a vivid testament to how the Sumerians saw the world, always placing human beings in intimate connection with the gods and always seeking the meaning of life through timeless stories. According to tradition, Gilgamesh was the fifth king of Uruk, ruling during the 3rd millennium before Christ. Ancient texts describe him as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a figure of extraordinary strength and wisdom. This greatness made him both the embodiment of royal power and a symbol of humanity's longing for immortality. Yet beneath the layers of myth, many scholars believe Gilgamesh truly existed. His name appears on the Sumerian king list, and archaeologists have uncovered inscriptions crediting him with the construction of Uruk's massive city walls, one of the greatest architectural achievements of its time. When we recall Gilgamesh, we remember not only a king or a hero, but also Uruk itself, the place where humanity first began to tell its own story. Yet Uruk did not stand alone in an empty plain. Across Mesopotamia stretched countless other centers of power, each city-state with its own patron deity, its own ruler, its own laws. Sumer was never a unified nation. It was a constellation of city-states, Uruk, Lagash, Kish, Umma, Eridu, small universes existing side by side, often in tension. This fragmentation produced a landscape rich and dynamic, but it also sowed the seeds of endless conflict, making it difficult for Sumer to sustain lasting stability. Conflict most often arose from Sumer's very lifeblood, land and water. The Mesopotamian plain was fertile, but also prone to salinization and dependent on careful irrigation. A single canal could feed an entire city, but if diverted or blocked, it could starve whole communities. As a result, city-states frequently clashed over control of waterways. The rivalry between Lagash and Umma is one of the most famous examples. For generations, these two neighbors fought bitterly over a strip of fertile borderland. On carved stelae, we see King Eannatum of Lagash boasting of his victory over Umma. Yet only decades later, Umma reclaimed the same land. The conflict was a cycle without end, a loop that no side could escape. Beyond resources, city-states also competed for political and religious supremacy. Kish once claimed to hold divine kingship, but Uruk under Gilgamesh challenged that claim. Later, the third dynasty of Ur rose to dominance, only to be followed by Akkad under Sargon. The throne of Mesopotamia never belonged to one city forever. It passed continuously from one ruler to another through war. This constant shift revealed both the flexibility and the fragility of Sumer's political system, dynamic and inventive, yet weakened by the absence of enduring unity. War between city-states was not just about resources, it was also a matter of honor and divine will. Each city believed its god favored it above all others, and defeat in battle was seen not only as a loss of land, but as a sign that its deity had abandoned it. Thus, war carried a sacred quality, bloody rituals through which kings and people sought to prove divine favor. On stelae such as the stele of the vultures from Lagash, we see armies marching in disciplined ranks bearing holy symbols. These carvings commemorated not only victories, but also the belief that the gods themselves had chosen the victor. These wars shaped the very fabric of Sumerian society. To sustain armies, kings conscripted farmers from their fields, forming vast ranks of soldiers. Trade was disrupted, production slowed, and often both sides emerged weakened. Yet through conflict, the city-states also learned organization, advanced military technology, and developed stronger weapons and faster chariots. Each clash, however destructive, drove society toward greater complexity and innovation. The irony was that this relentless rivalry left Sumer vulnerable to outsiders. While the city-states exhausted themselves in mutual warfare, nomadic tribes from the Zagros highlands or the Amorites from the west quietly advanced. When they came, the city-states of Sumer were rarely able to unite, suspicion among them running too deep. This internal division, like a widening crack, made the very foundations of Sumer fragile before every external storm. Looking back, we see that conflict among the city-states was both Sumer's strength and its fatal weakness. It fostered competition, invention, and grandeur, but it also prevented Sumer from transcending its local boundaries to become a lasting empire. For centuries, Sumer shone brightly, like a constellation of many stars, yet it never became a single sun. And it was precisely in this fractured landscape that a new figure emerged, one who would change everything, Sargon of Akkad. Though not a Sumerian himself, he became the first to unite the city-states into a far-reaching empire. His rise marked a turning point. From scattered fragments, Mesopotamia would, for the first time, experience the power of a unified realm. Akkad is not as familiar a name as Ur or Uruk, for archaeologists have yet to identify the exact location of the city. Yet in the memory of history, Akkad was the cradle of a dynasty that ushered in a new age. The Akkadians spoke a Semitic language, unlike Sumerian, and it was this blending of cultures that breathed new life into Mesopotamia. Around the 24th century before Christ, while the Sumerian city-states were still locked in their endless struggles for power, Sargon, a man of humble origins, stepped onto the stage and transformed the entire political landscape. Legend says Sargon began as a gardener for the king of Kish, or perhaps as a cupbearer at the royal court. Some stories tell of his infancy when he was set adrift on a river and rescued by a gardener, details that echo later myths of Moses or Cyrus. Whatever the truth, Sargon rose from the lowest ranks to the pinnacle of power, a rare feat in a rigidly stratified society. Through cunning and ambition, he seized authority in Kish and quickly expanded outward. Sargon was more than a warrior. He was a brilliant organizer. He conquered one Sumerian city-state after another, binding them under a central authority. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Eridu all fell in succession. Yet he did not stop there. His empire stretched northward into Syria and Anatolia, with some records claiming his armies reached as far as the Mediterranean Sea. For the first time, a political entity expanded far beyond local boundaries, reaching from the Persian Gulf to the western coasts of Asia. To rule this vast territory, Sargon created an administrative system without precedent. He appointed loyal officials to govern each city, established networks of communication across roads and rivers, and used cuneiform writing to manage resources and issue decrees. He also maintained a standing army, unlike the seasonal militias of earlier Sumer, ensuring that his power rested not only on charisma, but on enduring institutions. What is remarkable is how quickly Akkadians and Sumerians blended. The Akkadians adopted cuneiform writing, Sumerian myths and rituals, while promoting their Semitic tongue as the new language of administration. The result was a unique synthesis. Sumerian culture was preserved and disseminated more widely than ever before, while the Akkadian language became a unifying tool. Through Sargon, Sumerian civilization escaped its local boundaries and entered a broader regional stage. Yet, like all powers, the Akkadian Empire faced trials. After Sargon, his successors, most notably Naram-Sin, continued to expand and strengthen the empire. Naram-Sin even declared himself god of Akkad, the first Mesopotamian king, to elevate himself above the role of divine representative. But this bold act of self-deification became, in the eyes of many, a cause for disaster. Stories tell that the gods punished Akkad with famine, rebellion, invasions, and natural calamities. Raids by the Gutians and internal unrest eventually fractured the empire, leading to its collapse within only a few generations. Though it lasted scarcely 2 centuries, the Akkadian Empire left a profound legacy. It proved that unification was possible, that a single ambitious and gifted individual could reshape the destiny of an entire land. More importantly, it demonstrated that Sumerian culture was not confined to a handful of small city-states, but could serve as the foundation of a vast empire. Akkad opened the door for later powers, Babylon and Assyria, to rise, establishing the long tradition of empire in Mesopotamia. When the light of Akkad faded, the land once more plunged into chaos. Gutian tribes from the Zagros Mountains swept down, tearing apart the order that Sargon and his descendants had so carefully built. The Sumerian city-states, long accustomed to rivalry, fell into a spiral of instability, power fragmented, economies collapsed, populations suffered. Sumerian texts describe this period with deep gloom: failed harvests, abandoned temples, laws no longer observed. Some inscriptions even lamented that justice had vanished from the land. In Sumerian memory, this was a dark age, a time when it seemed even the gods had turned away. Yet even in disorder, history carried the seeds of renewal. From Ur, a wealthy city near the mouth of the Euphrates, a new dynasty rose to restore order, the third dynasty of Ur, founded by Ur-Nammu around 2112 before Christ. Ur-Nammu quickly asserted dominance by defeating foreign tribes, subduing neighboring city-states, and creating a strong central government. From the ashes, Sumer was once again united, not under the banner of Akkad, but beneath the standard of Ur. Ur-Nammu was more than a warrior, he was an exceptional organizer. The Ur Third administration rebuilt irrigation systems, reopened canals, and secured agriculture against disaster. They restored temples, especially the great ziggurat of Ur, transforming the city into a radiant religious center. On the legal front, Ur-Nammu issued the oldest known written law code, predating Hammurabi's by centuries. Though only fragments survive, the code reveals an effort to make justice concrete, replacing cycles of vengeance with a system of fines and compensation. This was a bold leap forward, reflecting an early vision of rule by law. His successor, King Shulgi, carried the dynasty to its peak. Shulgi reigned for nearly 50 years, a remarkable span in the ancient world, and fashioned himself into a model of the god-king. In surviving texts, he is praised not only as a warrior, but also as a musician, poet, and even athlete. He expanded scribal schools, standardized weights and measures, and built roads that linked cities across the land, creating an administrative and economic network that made Ur-3 the beating heart of southern Mesopotamia. This was also a golden age for art and literature. Hymns to the gods, royal praises, and epics were recorded on a large scale. The Sumerians once again felt the favor of the divine after long years of disorder. For roughly a century, Ur-3 brought rare stability and prosperity to the land, yet shadows still lingered on the horizon. Despite its brilliance, Ur-3 carried familiar weaknesses. Its administrative system, though detailed, grew cumbersome, prone to bureaucracy and corruption. Endless military campaigns to hold its borders drained resources. Amorite tribes pressed from the west, Elamites from the east. By the reign of Ibbi-Sin, the last king of Ur-3, the state was exhausted, unable to withstand mounting pressures. In 2004 before Christ, Elamite armies stormed Ur, ending the dynasty in devastation. The fall of Ur-3 closed the final chapter of Sumer's golden age. Afterward, the Amorites rose to establish Babylon, inheriting and reshaping the Sumerian legacy in their own way. Yet what matters most is that Ur-3 proved the Sumerians' resilience, that even after collapse, they could rebuild and create brilliance anew. It was a reminder that history never flows in a straight line. It oscillates between ruin and rebirth. When Ur-3 collapsed, Sumer entered a decline from which it would not recover. Its once magnificent city-states shrank, absorbed by emerging powers. And yet, before vanishing from history's stage, the Sumerians left behind enduring gifts, intangible but everlasting tools that continued to nurture and shape the civilizations that followed. Among the Sumerians' most remarkable legacies was their knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and the calendar. These were not abstract pursuits, but the fundamental frameworks that allowed people to measure the world, to organize time, calculate space, and follow the rhythms of the cosmos in order to predict the future. With these systems, crowded societies could function, harvests could be planted and reaped at the right moment, and laws and rituals could unfold in order. Even today, we live according to conventions first conceived 5,000 years ago on the floodplains of Sumer. The Sumerians did not develop mathematics to solve abstract equations, but out of practical necessity, managing grain, dividing irrigation water, calculating taxes, and constructing buildings. From these needs, they created a distinctive numerical system, the sexagesimal system, based on 60. For us, the number 60 is so familiar that we scarcely notice it. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. All of this derives from Sumerian thought. The base 60 system, with its ability to divide evenly into many smaller numbers, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on, proved immensely useful for measurement and calculation. Clay tablets reveal that they worked with fractions, square roots, and even primitive quadratic equations. Alongside mathematics, astronomy flourished. Over the vast Mesopotamian plain, the night sky stretched boundless and dark, an eternal book for the Sumerians to study. This was not done for amusement, but for survival. When would the floods arrive? When should seeds be planted? And when should crops be harvested? Such questions drove them to observe the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. They recognized the lunar cycle and created months of 29 or 30 days. They divided the year into 12 months based on the moon's phases, and to adjust for the solar year, they occasionally added an intercalary month. This was the forerunner of the lunisolar calendars used by later civilizations. Sumerian astronomy was never separated from religion. Each celestial body was seen as divine. Venus belonged to Inanna, the sun to Utu, the moon to Nanna. Observing the heavens was therefore both proto-science and astrology. Priests read the movement of stars to foretell omens, to decide when to march to war or when to hold festivals. Though their observations were mingled with belief, these records laid the groundwork for both Western astronomy and astrology. Through this, the calendar became the rope binding communities into a shared rhythm. The year was punctuated by great festivals tied to agricultural cycles and religious rites. Each month and each season held sacred meaning, celebrated with ritual and song. Thanks to the calendar, people no longer lived at the mercy of nature's uncertainty. Time became a flowing current that could be predicted and ordered. With it, states could collect taxes on schedule, organize labor, and govern effectively. Thousands of clay tablets preserve their calculations, numerical tables, and astronomical records. Some still astonish scholars today. One tablet shows a deep understanding of right-angled triangles, another contains a close approximation of the value of pi. Though not modern science, they testify to the sharp intellect and relentless observation of the Sumerians. We still live within the framework they created. We count time in hours, minutes, and seconds. We divide circles into 360 degrees. We organize societies with calendars they first devised. Each time we glance at a watch or plot a point with coordinates, we hear the faint echo of Uruk, and Lagash. And yet this knowledge was never only about measurement or administration. It was also a tool to master nature, to feed tens of thousands of people on a demanding plane. Here, irrigation, the craft bound to Sumer from its very beginnings, emerges as living proof of their collective genius. The Sumerians built vast irrigation systems, carving canals that stretched for many miles to draw water from the rivers into the fields. From the great channels, smaller canals branched out, leading finally to narrow ditches that watered each plot of land. Dikes were raised along the rivers to contain floods, while sluices and gates were designed to regulate the flow. Such projects demanded the cooperation of entire communities. No single family could dig or maintain a canal that stretched for miles. Out of this necessity arose the foundation of the early state, leaders to give orders, officials to organize, and laws to assign labor. Land management was inseparable from irrigation. Farmland in Sumer was divided into categories: temple land belonging to the gods, royal land under the king, and private fields of the farmers. These plots were not distributed at random. Boundaries, acreage, and expected yields were carefully recorded in cuneiform. Each piece of land carried obligations, paying taxes, providing produce for temples or the palace, or contributing labor for public works. Thus, land was not merely private property, it was a component of the larger political and economic system. Yet irrigation also carried long-term challenges. One of the most serious was salinization. As river water flowed through the canals and evaporated under the blazing sun, salt accumulated on the soil, gradually robbing it of fertility. Archaeological studies reveal that southern Mesopotamia once produced abundant wheat, but later farmers were forced to switch to barley, a crop more tolerant of salt. This agricultural shift likely contributed to the weakening of city-states, as the very foundation of their sustenance began to erode. The Sumerians could control the flow of water, but they lacked the knowledge to prevent the long-term consequences of their own system. Land distribution also reflected the sharp divisions of society. The temple and royal estates were fertile and well-maintained, while poorer farmers often worked less productive plots. If harvests failed or debts mounted, they could lose their land, even selling themselves or their children into slavery for wealthy landowners. Nobles and priests, controlling both large estates and the water supply, wielded immense power. In this sense, irrigation and land management were both lifeline and instrument of social control. And yet it cannot be denied that these irrigation projects turned the Sumerian plain into a place capable of sustaining tens of thousands of people, an extraordinary feat in such a harsh climate. The canals, dikes, and systems of land management revealed the Sumerians' extraordinary organizational abilities. Looking at maps of ancient canals today, one sees a web like veins, carrying the lifeblood of the rivers to every field and every village. Irrigation was not only practical, but also spiritual. Ancient texts describe the digging of canals and the raising of dikes as sacred works carried out by kings in the name of the gods. Each new project was a demonstration that human beings could work together to turn chaos into order, to transform a harsh landscape into a source of life. From these flowing waters came not only survival, but also surplus to nurture literature, art, law, and most of all, the great myths. Among these, the Epic of Gilgamesh stands as a jewel, a blend of literature, philosophy, and a heartfelt message from the Sumerians to posterity. It tells not only the story of a king, but reflects humanity's timeless anxieties, friendship, mortality, the yearning for immortality, truths so deeply human that people across every age can see themselves in it. What makes the Epic of Gilgamesh eternal is not the monsters of the cedar forest or the Great Flood, but a simple, profound realization. Immortality does not reside in the body, but in memory and in the works a person leaves behind. The story opens a world saturated with myth, yet filled with pain and longing deeply human. Gilgamesh, the king who was 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, begins his journey arrogant and cruel, but through his friendship with Enkidu, and above all through the grief of Enkidu's death, he is forced to confront the limits of human life. When he returns to Uruk, he does not bring the plant of immortality, but instead a new wisdom. Eternity belongs to the city, to its walls, and to the collective memory, not to fragile flesh. It is this philosophical depth that allows the Epic of Gilgamesh to transcend time. For 5,000 years, it has moved people with the same timeless question: how can we resist death? And perhaps the answer is not in fleeing mortality, but in the mark we leave for those who follow. This is not merely the thought of the Sumerians, but the shared voice of humanity itself. What sets Sumerian literature apart is its profound humanism. When Gilgamesh grieves for Enkidu, it is no longer the tragedy of a legendary king, but the universal sorrow of loss and finitude. When the hymns describe Inanna in her fury, we see reflected the chaos of human life. When they praise her as the goddess of love, we hear the joy bound to creation and renewal. These texts are at once the voice of an early society and the foundation for the entire tradition of world literature. If the Epic of Gilgamesh shows how the Sumerians used writing to face fear, preserve memory, and search for meaning in death, their hymns reveal another purpose: shaping and controlling community life. From poetry to law, the clay tablet became the tool that formed both the soul and the social order. And just as their literature reached beyond its age, Sumerian law too extended its influence, laying a path that every later civilization would follow. When we think of ancient law, our minds often leap to the famous Code of Hammurabi of Babylon, carved into a towering black basalt stele. Yet centuries before Hammurabi, it was the Sumerians who first laid the foundation for the idea of legal order, transforming justice from an oral tradition into written rules inscribed for permanence on clay. It was they, not Babylon, who first conceived of regulating human behavior through written law, and in doing so, they created the groundwork upon which all later codes were built. Archaeological evidence shows that as early as the 3rd millennium before Christ, Sumerian city-states had their own codes. One of the earliest we know of is the Code of Urukagina of Lagash, around the 24th century before Christ. Though only fragments survive, they reveal an effort to limit the excessive power of nobles and priests and to protect ordinary people from exploitation. Urukagina prohibited the unlawful seizure of temple property, reduced burdensome taxes, and sought to ensure justice for lower classes. Primitive as it was, this was the first sign of a state stepping in to safeguard social fairness. By the time of Ur-Nammu, founder of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, around 2112 before Christ, law had grown more systematic. The Code of Ur-Nammu, discovered on clay tablets at Nippur, is considered the oldest surviving written legal code. Though only about 30 provisions remain, they mark a great leap forward. Most offences were no longer punished by blood vengeance, but by monetary compensation. For example, if a person caused injury, the law prescribed a specific fine in silver rather than direct retaliation. This was a fundamental change, shifting justice from the emotional to the rational, from personal to communal. The laws also reflect the stratified nature of Sumerian society. Free citizens, slaves, women, and children each had defined rights and duties under the law. To modern eyes, such distinctions may seem unjust, but in that time, acknowledging these differences gave stability to society. Law did not only protect the powerful, it also gave the powerless a framework within which they could appeal, however limited. Successors after Ur-Nammu, such as Lipit Ishtar of Isin, around the 20th century before Christ, also issued their own codes. The Code of Lipit Ishtar, written in both Sumerian and Akkadian, broadened legal scope to cover property ownership, debt, marriage, and slavery. These texts show that Sumerian law was not the creation of one ruler, but a continuous tradition, each generation building upon the work of the last. What is striking is that Sumerian law was not only coercive, it was legitimizing. Each code began with a prologue in which the king declared that he issued the laws by divine command to bring justice to the people. This tied royal authority to divine will, presenting law as part of the cosmic order. When a judgment was enforced, it was not merely the state's decree, but the God's will manifest. Placed beside Hammurabi's code, Sumerian law shows a clear line of continuity. Hammurabi did not create from nothing. He inherited a tradition centuries old. His achievement was to systematize, expand, and elevate it into a political monument. In this sense, Hammurabi's code was the culmination of a path first blazed by the Sumerians, by Urukagina, Ur-Nammu, and Lipit-Ishtar. Most important of all, Sumerian law introduced a new way of thinking. Justice no longer rested on personal revenge or the whims of the strong, but on shared rules binding the whole community. This was a revolutionary shift, moving human society from reliance on violence to reliance on legal order. Through law, together with writing, economy, and religion, the influence of Sumer spread across the Near East, leaving deep imprints on neighboring civilizations. From Akkad to Babylon to Assyria, all were built upon the foundation first laid in Sumer, like ripples spreading outward long after the first stone fell upon the water. If we look closely, many elements we often associate with Babylon, Assyria, or even later Greece, in fact trace their roots back to Sumer. The most direct influence appeared in Akkad. When Sargon created the world's first empire, neither he nor his descendants rejected the Sumerian legacy. Instead, they absorbed and elevated it. The Akkadians adopted cuneiform writing, using it to record their Semitic language, creating a bilingual tradition: Sumerian for religion and scholarship, Akkadian for administration and daily affairs. This continuity allowed cuneiform to endure for over 2,000 years, becoming the shared medium of communication across the Near East. The impact is even clearer in Babylon. Under Hammurabi in the 18th century before Christ, the kingdom built firmly upon Sumerian foundations. Hammurabi's famous code, while more expansive and refined, followed the path already laid by Ur-Nammu and Lipit-Ishtar. The gods of Sumer were reimagined in Babylon. Inanna became Ishtar, Enki became Ea, Utu became Shamash. Sumerian mythology, rituals, and literature were woven into Babylonian culture, and over the centuries, Babylon carried these traditions forward to other peoples. Assyria in the north was no exception. Though remembered for military might, Assyria relied on cuneiform and inherited Sumer's administrative traditions. In diplomatic texts and rituals, Assyrian kings consistently emphasized that they were heirs of the ancient cultural stream, that is, the Sumerian stream. In this way, Sumer served as the memory core of the entire Near East, a heritage no later state could deny. The reach of Sumer extended beyond Mesopotamia. Sumerian merchants carried writing, art, and goods east to Elam, in present-day Iran, north to Anatolia, and southeast to the Indus Valley. Archaeologists have discovered Sumerian cylinder seals at Harappan sites, proof of trade and cultural exchange. Through these contacts, ideas of administration, religion, and symbolism spread across borders, planting seeds in distant civilizations. Another crucial sphere of influence was astronomy and calendrical science. Later, Babylonians and Assyrians inherited the lunisolar calendar and time divisions first devised in Sumer. This unified the Near East under a shared temporal framework, making administration, commerce, and religious observance more cohesive. Through Greece and Rome, these conventions eventually reached us. Even today, they survive in the hours, minutes, and seconds on our clocks. Sumer's influence was not only technical and intellectual, but also cosmological and spiritual. Many Sumerian myths became the foundation for later traditions. The story of the Great Flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh was preserved by Babylon and later echoed in the Bible's tale of Noah. Myths of Enki, Inanna, and the creation of humans from clay left imprints on Hebrew, Greek, and even Abrahamic religious traditions. In the Bible and in Greek mythology, we still catch glimpses of Sumer, ideas first inscribed on clay tablets 5,000 years ago. In this sense, Sumer was not only the first civilization, but the foundation civilization of the region. Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, and Elam each added their own colors, but all were built upon the framework Sumer had created. To speak of the ancient Near East is impossible without Sumer, as if Sumer were the deep root from which all later branches grew. Its legacy continued under other names, while the name Sumer itself gradually faded into silence, only to return much later in humanity's recovered memory. When the third dynasty of collapsed at the dawn of the second millennium before Christ, the chapter of Sumerian history nearly closed. Yet the power vacuum did not last long. From the west came waves of Amorites, nomadic and semi-nomadic groups who entered Mesopotamia not as a single conquering horde, but in scattered bands. At first they sought pasture and settlement, but gradually they integrated, took control, and eventually seized political power. The Amorites were Semitic in origin, distinct from the Sumerians in language and custom. Initially, the native elites looked down on them as outsiders, but the Amorites adapted quickly. They learned cuneiform, worshipped Sumerian gods, and ran society with laws and bureaucracy. In the wake of Ur's destruction by Elam, when the old city-states were gravely weakened, the Amorites built small kingdoms in Isin, Larsa, Eshnunna, and elsewhere. Each preserved the Sumerian tradition, even as they reshaped it. Their greatest achievement was the rise of Babylon. Once a small town on the Euphrates, Babylon became the new center under Amorite kings, especially Hammurabi in the 18th century before Christ. Hammurabi conquered Larsa, Eshnunna, Mari, and unified southern and central Mesopotamia. Once again, the land between the rivers came under a single authority, not Ur or Akkad, but Babylon. The ascent of Babylon was inseparable from the Sumerian foundation. Cuneiform continued, now recording primarily the Akkadian language, the Amorites' mother tongue. Sumerian mythology was absorbed. Inanna became Ishtar, Enki became Ea, Utu became Shamash. Administration, religion, and law were inherited and centralized. The Code of Hammurabi, though more famous, directly followed Sumerian precedents, carved in stone both to enforce justice and to display royal power. Babylon understood how to turn legacy into politics. If Uruk had celebrated Gilgamesh as a legendary hero, Babylon elevated its kings into living symbols of justice and order. If Ur III had issued laws to stabilize society, Hammurabi engraved them in the public square, making law itself a proclamation of power. Alongside this, Sumerian knowledge endured: the base 60 system, the lunisolar calendar, astronomy. Later, Babylonian astronomers would chart planetary movements and construct detailed tables of calculation, all built on Sumerian foundations. Babylon thus became the new emblem of prosperity and power. If Ur dazzled with its great ziggurat, Babylon rose with legendary monuments like the Hanging Gardens and the Ishtar Gate. Through these symbols, Babylon declared itself both heir to Sumer and its surpasser. Yet Babylon's rise meant Sumer's distinct identity faded. The Sumerian language became a dead tongue used only in religion and scholarship, like Latin in medieval Europe. The old city-states shrank into provinces under the new capital's shadow. The very name Sumer disappeared from political texts, replaced by Akkad or Babylon. One of history's greatest ironies is that the very people who pioneered civilization, who invented writing, law, the city-state, and the first epic, vanished earliest from human memory. The Sumerians did not disappear in a single day, or year, or battle, but faded gradually, like morning mist, leaving their imprint on others' cultures while losing their own name. This erasure of memory began with the rise of the Amorites and Babylon. Akkadian replaced Sumerian in daily life. Sumer survived only in the phrase Sumer and Akkad, before vanishing entirely, supplanted by Akkad and Babylon. By the 7th century before Christ, the Assyrians remembered Sumer only as a distant echo. Even their myths and epics copied into Akkadian obscured their origins. Inanna became Ishtar, Enki became Ea. The Epic of Gilgamesh, born in Uruk, survived mainly through Babylonian and Assyrian copies, leading later generations to believe it belonged to those successor cultures. As the name Sumer faded, its legacy endured. Sumerian lore paved the way for Hammurabi. Their astronomy and calendars lived on in Babylon. Their cuneiform script, though written in Akkadian, retained its Sumerian structure. Their myths and epics were retold across generations. The Sumerians disappeared from politics and language, but not from culture. For millennia, however, humanity forgot they had ever existed. The Greeks and Romans never knew of them. The Bible mentioned only the vague Shinar. To the medieval world, all that remained were mounds of broken bricks lying silent in the Iraqi desert. No one suspected that beneath the dust lay the civilization that had first drawn the line between prehistory and history. It was not until the 19th century that the truth returned. European archaeologists, driven by a passion for the Orient, began excavating Mesopotamia. At first they sought to confirm the Bible, but soon they uncovered clay tablets inscribed with strange signs unlike any known language. These wedge-shaped marks, cuneiform, were eventually deciphered, thanks especially to the Behistun inscription. And in the oldest texts, one name appeared again and again: Sumer. The discovery was stunning. Long before Babylon and Assyria, there had been an independent people speaking a non-Semitic language, leaving behind a massive archive. Excavations at Uruk, Lagash, and Nippur gradually revealed the splendor of a civilization lost. When Leonard Woolley uncovered the royal tombs of in the 1920s, filled with gold, silver, gems, and musical instruments, the world awoke to the richness of a society that history had forgotten. This rediscovery was not just an archaeological triumph, but a shock to human understanding. It forced history to be rewritten. Civilization had not begun in Egypt or Babylon, but earlier in Sumer, the people who first bridged the gulf between prehistory and history. Yet even then, another question lingered. If even the first known civilization could be forgotten for thousands of years, how certain can we be that Sumer was truly the first? Or was history always more complex, with multiple centers rising side by side, Sumer simply leaving the clearest mark? Scholars generally agree that Sumer emerged very early in the 4th millennium before Christ, with the culture of Uruk leaving a profound mark. Yet at the same time, other complex societies were also rising elsewhere. Along the Nile, Egyptian communities had developed agriculture, built temples, and by about 3100 before Christ had unified into a state under the first pharaoh. In the Indus Valley, in present-day Pakistan and India, the Harappan and Mohenjo-Daro cultures built large urban centers with advanced drainage systems, fired brick houses, and even city planning. In China, the Longshan culture and later the Shang dynasty revealed early elements of civilization, metallurgy, writing, and ancestor worship. So why is Sumer often called the first? The main reason lies in writing. The Sumerians are the earliest people for whom we have clear evidence of systematically recording language in a written form, cuneiform. Writing transformed memory into text, turned laws, contracts, and hymns into something that could outlast generations. Egypt also developed hieroglyphs at roughly the same time, but Sumerian cuneiform is considered more systematic and far-reaching, eventually becoming the international language of the Near East. In the Indus Valley, we find inscribed symbols on seals, but since they remain undeciphered, it is unclear whether they were a true writing system or simply trademarks. Another reason Sumer carries the title first is its model of the city-state. By around 3200 before Christ, Uruk may have had a population of 40 to 50,000, an enormous figure for that time. The city had defensive walls, temples, residential quarters, and marketplaces, forming a template for urban life. Compared to this, settlements elsewhere were far smaller. That is why Uruk is often called the first city in history. However, many modern scholars caution that the notion of first reflects a 19th century Western perspective, when archaeology focused heavily on Mesopotamia and Egypt. In reality, centers of civilization emerged simultaneously in different places, each with its own character. To call Sumer the first civilization may be accurate if we focus on writing and city-states, but it oversimplifies a much more complex picture. Some argue that emphasizing firstness obscures cultural interconnections. The Sumerians did not live in isolation, they traded with Iran, Anatolia, and even the Indus Valley. Certain ideas and techniques may have traveled into or out of Sumer rather than appearing entirely independently. Archaeology suggests that civilization never developed along a single straight line from one point, but rather through a web of interactions among multiple centers. Therefore, when we call Sumer the first civilization, the point is not to rank who came before or after. What matters is that Sumer opened the doorway for humanity into the age of history, when people not only lived in the present, but preserved memory, law, and belief for future generations. Sumer may not have been first in every respect, but they were undoubtedly a symbol of the first great turning point, the moment humankind stepped out of prehistory and into history. And the rediscovery of Sumer in modern times raises an even greater question. How could a civilization so important have been forgotten for millennia? Was it erased deliberately, or did it simply dissolve naturally into the empires that followed? That question continues to inspire debate and invites countless other theories, some far beyond the boundaries of mainstream scholarship. One of the most sensational alternative theories is the claim that the Sumerians once had contact with, perhaps were even guided by, an extraterrestrial race often called the Anunnaki. This idea has captivated the public imagination because it feeds both curiosity and a longing for a transcendent explanation behind the sudden brilliance of the world's first civilization. Yet it has also sparked constant debate among scholars, since the line between mythology, symbolic interpretation, and unfounded speculation is thin and often misused. The story begins with Sumerian mythology. In the ancient texts, the Anunnaki were described as a powerful assembly of gods, a council of judges dwelling in heaven and the underworld. They were thought to decide the fate of humanity, to grant laws, and even to intervene directly in human survival. For the Sumerians, these were simply gods, religious expressions of how the universe worked. But in the 20th century, modern writers, most famously Zecharia Sitchin, reinterpreted the Anunnaki as aliens from a planet called Nibiru, who supposedly created or modified humankind to serve them. According to this hypothesis, the rapid advances of Sumer from writing, law, and architecture to astronomy were too sudden to be the product of a primitive society. Sitchin argued that the Sumerians were merely students of the Anunnaki, and that their gods were actually distorted memories of beings from beyond Earth. From this idea sprang countless questions. Who built the massive monuments? Who gave humanity knowledge of the cosmos? Are we the result of alien intervention? Mainstream archaeology and history firmly reject this theory, pointing out that it rests on misreadings of ancient texts and blends myth with science fiction. The Sumerians, they argue, did not need aliens to explain their achievements. They had practical reasons: a challenging environment that forced innovation, active trade, and cultural exchange with neighbors, and the organizational power of dense city-states. These conditions were enough to spark a leap forward in civilization, rare but by no means impossible. Still, the Anunnaki theory endures, even thriving in popular culture. Why? Because it touches a deep human desire, the belief that we are not alone, that ancient myths might hold distorted echoes of some greater truth. It transforms Sumer from a dry subject of archaeology into a realm of mystery, a stage for humanity's cosmic imagination. The key is not to dismiss or to accept such theories blindly, but to see them as mirrors of how we interpret myth. The Sumerians wrote of the Anunnaki not to craft science, but to place human life within a cosmos governed by powers beyond control. When modern readers cast the Anunnaki as aliens, they are reinterpreting myth in the language of our own age, an era where space travel and distant worlds have replaced holy mountains and heavens as symbols of the unknown. In this way, the Anunnaki myth speaks not only of the past, but of the present, of humanity's enduring need for a grand story that transcends our limits and explains our place in the universe. Through the Anunnaki, Sumer becomes a mirror reflecting the imagination of humankind across the ages, from ancient myth to modern science fiction. As we close our journey into Sumer, what lingers is not only the clay tablets, the towering ziggurats, or the names that once thundered across the land before fading into silence. What endures is the moment when humanity first realized it could remember, could organize, and could transform memory into history. Sumer was not the absolute beginning, but it was where the bridge from prehistory to history was built most clearly. There, humankind first dared to believe that social order could rest on writing and law, that a city could outlast the lifetime of any single person, that the story of an individual or a community could be carried forward to generations yet to come. And because of this, even though the name Sumer faded for millennia, their legacy never truly disappeared. It lives on in the 60-minute hour, in the alphabets that grew from their script, in the flood myths and hero tales retold across cultures. Sumer is like the faint underlayer of a great painting, not immediately visible but supporting every line and color above it. Perhaps the greatest gift Sumer left us is not any single invention, but a reminder. Every civilization, no matter how great, can vanish from memory. But the act of remembering, of telling stories, of writing, allows humanity to resist oblivion. By remembering Sumer today, we are continuing what they themselves began, writing history as a defense against the darkness of time.